Hey there, and welcome to Tales by June, where hearts break, heal, and sometimes seek revenge. Let's begin today's story.
Hey, before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.
I was always the quiet one, the invisible child in a house that thrived on appearances and whispers. My name is Alice, and I grew up in a house that felt more like a stage than a home. White walls, polished floors, and the constant hum of judgment. My parents, Martha and Leonard, had high expectations, but not for me. They saved their smiles, their attention, their love for my sister, Claire. From the moment she could walk, she was the star. And I was just a shadow following behind her, careful not to trip on my own loneliness. Our home sat on the outskirts of Charleston, a sprawling property with a manicured lawn and rooms that smelled faintly of lemon polish. I spent most of my childhood in the attic, a small space they called my playroom, though it was really just storage for things no one wanted. Dusty boxes, old holiday decorations, and a tiny window that framed the sky like a painting. Up there, I invented a world where I mattered. I gave my dolls voices, told them stories about courage and justice, and pretended that someone, somewhere, was cheering for me. Claire, on the other hand, floated through life like sunlight. Everyone adored her. She had this effortless charm, the kind that made teachers overlook her arrogance and neighbors offer her gifts just because she smiled. When I fell on the playground, scraping my knees, my parents would pat my shoulder and sigh. When Claire fell, the world seemed to tilt, and she was lifted onto a pedestal. I learned early that the world rewarded beauty and boldness, not quiet hearts. By the time I was 10, I understood the unspoken rules. Speak only when spoken to. Smile politely, but never too brightly. And above all, stay out of Claire's way. My parents would never admit it aloud, but the favoritism was a force of nature in our home. It shaped everything. Birthday presents, vacation plans, even who got a seat at the dinner table. Claire's successes were celebrated, mine were ignored. I remember one afternoon vividly. I had spent weeks perfecting a painting for the school art contest. I poured every ounce of my heart into it, every stroke a silent plea for recognition. On the night of the showcase, my parents walked past my painting, barely glancing, before moving to Claire's piece, cooing and clapping like she had reinvented art itself. My chest ached with a mix of anger and despair. I wanted to scream, to throw the canvas at the wall, but instead, I whispered to myself, I'll be seen someday. They'll wish they had noticed me. My friends were few. I didn't trust easily. The betrayal I felt from my family had taught me caution. But I did have Emma, my next-door neighbor. She was the only person who saw me without judgment. She didn't care that I was quiet or overshadowed. She loved my stories, my imagination, my gentle heart. We'd sit in the backyard, sipping lemonade, spinning dreams about escaping our small town and making names for ourselves. I promised myself then that if the world wouldn't notice me, I would make it impossible to ignore me. High school only sharpened the divide. Claire thrived in every club, every team, every social circle. She dated the popular boys, wore the best clothes, and laughed like life owed her something. Meanwhile, I learned to disappear even further. Teachers called on me once or twice, but I rarely raised my hand. I became an observer, a recorder, a silent strategist. I watched people's weaknesses, their fears, the way their smiles didn't always reach their eyes. And I learned that observation could be power if wielded carefully. The biggest wound came when I was 17. Claire met Mark, a handsome, charming boy with an easy smile. I had known him from soccer practice, someone kind and warm. For a fleeting moment, I dared to hope, thinking maybe life would grant me one small joy. But Claire's presence was magnetic. She glided into his life, and soon he was hers, leaving me to watch from the sidelines as my only love turned into a trophy for my sister. My parents didn't even notice my heartbreak. They didn't have to, they were too busy celebrating Claire's victory. It was in that heartbreak that something inside me shifted. The sadness, the abandonment, the betrayal, all of it crystallized into something else. Not bitterness, not anger, not despair. Something sharper. Something I could use. I realized that my family had underestimated me for too long. They thought I would cry, beg, disappear into the shadows. But shadows, I learned, could be dangerous. Shadows could move unseen, strike unexpectedly, and vanish before anyone knew they were gone. That year, I began keeping a journal. Not a diary for emotions, but a record of intentions, observations, and strategies. I wrote down every slight, every favoritism, every whisper that had ever stung me. I studied people, learned the art of subtle manipulation, the power of patience, and the value of timing. I knew deep down that someday the world would pay attention, not because I demanded it, but because I would make it impossible to ignore me. Even in my isolation, I nurtured small victories. I earned scholarships, perfected my grades, and honed skills that Claire could never touch. While she thrived on charm, I thrived on preparation. While she burned bright, I grew strong. And in that strength, I found a quiet satisfaction that no amount of parental neglect could take away. By the time I graduated, I was no longer just the overlooked sister. I was Alice, the observer, the strategist, the one who knew the power of betrayal, even if I had not yet used it. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that the world I would face as an adult would test me in ways I could never imagine. And I would not just survive it. I would conquer it. I met Mark on a Thursday, the kind of rainy day that makes you question the universe. I was running late, juggling an umbrella and a notebook filled with sketches, trying not to slip on the wet sidewalk. That's when he bumped into me, nearly knocking me off balance. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately, his voice warm, unhurried. He crouched to help me pick up the notebook, his hazel eyes meeting mine with something I couldn't name at first. "Are you okay?" I think so," I muttered, embarrassed. My sketches were soaked in places, the ink bleeding into strange patterns, but he didn't seem to mind. "You're an artist?" he asked, tilting his head to look at the notebook. "Yes," I admitted, surprised he actually noticed. "Just doodles." "Doodles that survived the rain," he said, smiling. "I'd say that's impressive." There was something in his presence that made the world shrink to just the two of us. Over the next few weeks, we met for coffee, sometimes by chance, sometimes intentionally. I found myself looking forward to his messages, his laughter, the way he asked questions that made me think, not just answer. Mark didn't try to change me. He didn't compete for attention. He simply saw me, Alice, the quiet observer, and he liked what he saw. Our romance unfolded gently. There were picnics under oak trees, late-night walks with our shoes off in the grass, and moments when time seemed to pause entirely. I introduced him to my childhood hideaways, the attic where I used to paint and write, the little corner of the park where I had always found peace. He listened with awe, never judging, never rushing. And slowly, I realized I had never felt so completely understood by anyone. When Mark proposed, it was simple, intimate, and perfect. No grand gestures or crowded rooms, just a quiet evening on my favorite bench in the park where we first shared a long talk under the stars. "I want to see all your worlds," he said, holding my hands. "I want to be in them with you. Will you, Em? Will you marry me?" I said yes, without hesitation, because my heart had already said yes years before. The wedding was small, just close friends and family, but it felt cinematic in its simplicity. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and sunlight broke through the trees as I walked down the aisle. Mark's eyes were warm and glistening with tears. I knew in that moment that life had finally handed me something I had dreamed of but never dared to expect, someone who truly loved me for who I was, not who I could be in comparison to someone else. The first 3 years of marriage were a quiet kind of happiness. Our home, though modest, overflowed with warmth, books stacked carefully, plants reaching toward the light, and photographs capturing moments of laughter, travel, and simple shared routines. We had Sunday breakfasts with pancakes and too much syrup, weekday evenings filled with quiet conversation, and the comfort of knowing that we were building a life together, brick by brick. Evenings were our favorite. Mark would make tea while I worked on sketches or my writing, and we would sit by the window watching the sunset paint the sky. Sometimes he would read aloud to me, his voice low and soothing, and I would rest my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. It was ordinary, yes, but to me, it was extraordinary. 3 years in, life had its challenges, of course. Work deadlines, minor disagreements, the stress of bills and errands, but nothing we couldn't face together. We had grown into a rhythm, a balance, a partnership where love wasn't just words, but actions. And while the world outside might still judge me for being the quiet sister, the overlooked one, in our little universe, I was seen, cherished, and powerful in ways that had nothing to do with anyone else. Mark never needed to compete for my attention, and I never needed to prove myself to him. Our love was simple, strong, and enduring, a sanctuary from the chaos of life and the shadows of my past. In those 3 years, I learned that true love doesn't need fanfare or drama. It only needs presence, care, and the willingness to see the other person completely. And for the first time in my life, I understood that I had finally chosen my own happiness, not the one handed down by family, not the one defined by comparison, but a happiness entirely my own. 3 years into our marriage, life had begun to feel complicated. Not bad, not disastrous, just complicated. There were no affairs, no betrayals, no catastrophic revelations. Just the quiet, gnawing tension that comes from 2 lives merging and discovering that love alone isn't always enough to keep everything smooth. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Mark had started working longer hours at the marketing firm he loved, which I supported, of course. But sometimes he came home distracted, staring at his phone more than he looked at me, humming absent-mindedly as I talked about my day. I would catch him mid-thought, lips twitching as if he was forming a response to something invisible. "Mark," I asked one evening, setting my sketchbook aside. We had just finished dinner. I tried to keep my tone casual, though the flutter of unease had started in my stomach. He murmured, not looking up. I said, "Did you see my email about the gallery submission? The one I sent this morning?" "Oh, yeah," he said, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes softened, but there was a hint of fatigue there, something he was trying to hide. "Looks great. I'm sure they'll love it." I nodded, trying to brush off the sting of his inattentiveness. I had learned over the years to pick my battles. But that night, as I sat alone in our small living room after he had gone to bed, I realized I felt a strange, unfamiliar tension. I wasn't angry exactly. I was uneasy. The next few weeks brought more small cracks. We started bickering over trivial things, a forgotten grocery item, the way dishes were stacked, whose turn it was to take the trash out. I noticed myself getting frustrated in ways I hadn't before. I'd catch Mark sighing in exasperation or frowning at something I said, and my first instinct was defensiveness. But then, slowly, I began observing instead. Quietly, patiently, as I had always done. One Saturday morning, the tension finally surfaced in a way neither of us could ignore. Mark was on his laptop, reviewing campaign plans, and I was trying to concentrate on a painting I had been commissioned to complete. The room was silent, except for the tapping of his keyboard and the scratch of my pencil. "Mark," I said finally, a little sharper than intended. "Can we talk?" He didn't look up immediately, and when he did, his expression was tired but patient. "Sure. What's up?" I feel like we've been drifting. You're always busy, I'm always busy, and we barely talk anymore. I miss us." He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Alice, I don't want you to feel like that. I've just been under a lot of pressure at work. But I'm here, aren't I?" "I know you're here," I said softly, my throat tight. "But presence isn't the same as connection." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't realize it was that bad. I thought everything was fine. I know, Mark," I interrupted gently. "I know you're doing your best. But maybe we need to be more intentional. More present. For each other. Not just coexisting." He nodded slowly. "You're right. We can do that. I promise." Even as he said it, I felt the bittersweet weight of reality settle over me. Marriage, I realized, wasn't only about love and romance. It was about patience, compromise, and the willingness to face the cracks instead of pretending they didn't exist. And while I loved Mark deeply, I knew that if we didn't address these small frictions, they could grow into something larger, something harder to fix. In the days that followed, we made small adjustments, Sunday breakfasts together without phones, one evening a week dedicated to just us, occasional walks where we talked about dreams instead of deadlines. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to remind me that love was still there, still real, still worth nurturing. And yet, amid the adjustments, a part of me remained vigilant. My childhood had taught me the importance of observation, of understanding dynamics before they became crises. I watched myself and Mark closely, noting patterns, noting moments of tension and ease. I knew that marriage was more than just feelings, it was a delicate balance of hearts and minds, and it required constant attention. By the end of that month, the tension hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved. It became a quiet awareness, a reminder that life and love were not static, that relationships required effort, and that sometimes, the most subtle frictions could shape the future as much as the grand gestures. I realized then that this was a new phase of life, one where love alone wouldn't suffice. Where patience, communication, and understanding mattered more than any fairy tale promise. And as I watched Mark laughing softly at something on his laptop later that evening, I reminded myself we had chosen each other, and choosing each other again and again would be the test of our marriage. Little did I know, this test was only beginning. I had always known Claire could be manipulative, but I never imagined she would cross a line like this. It started subtly, the way toxic things often do, small coincidences, moments that made me pause and wonder. At first, it was innocent enough, Mark leaving messages unanswered, returning home later than usual, laughing at a text I couldn't see. But the truth, when it hit me, was like a blade to the chest. It was a rainy Thursday evening. I had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Mark with dinner. The smell of garlic and basil filled the apartment. Candles flickered on the counter. But the living room was empty. Then I heard voices. Low, intimate, impossibly close. I froze in the doorway, my chest tightening. There, on our couch, were Mark and Claire, their heads close together, laughing in a way that made my stomach twist. Claire's hand brushed his arm, a gesture so intimate it could belong only to lovers. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mind raced, every memory of their smiles, every shared glance I had once trusted, suddenly tainted. Mark, that's ridiculous, Claire said, her tone playful, teasing. You really think anyone would notice? Not if we're careful, he murmured, leaning closer. I don't want to hurt Alice, but I can't stop thinking about you. It was confirmation. Every suspicion, every quiet instinct I had ignored, had been right. My husband, the man I had loved and trusted, was betraying me with my own sister. I backed away quietly, tears stinging my eyes, and shut the door behind me. I didn't cry, not yet. I didn't scream. For once in my life, I needed to see clearly before I acted. I had to understand the extent of the betrayal. Over the next days, I observed. Subtle signs became glaring truths. Hidden messages on Mark's phone, emails that seemed innocent but carried coded familiarity, Claire's visits that lasted longer than she claimed. Everything fit into place. They were careful, but not careful enough. People who believe love can override morality always leave traces. And I found them. One evening, I followed Claire after a supposed work meeting. I watched from across the street as she met Mark in a cafe, the way their hands touched across the table, the way his eyes softened at her words. I felt anger, heartbreak, and something darker, a cold, sharp clarity. It wasn't enough for me to know. I needed evidence, proof that I could use if I chose. My instincts, honed by years of family neglect and observation, kicked in. I documented everything, screenshots, photos, small notes of meetings, timing, and behaviors. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture of their affair, the late-night rendezvous, the secretive glances, the whispered conversations. I confronted them indirectly first. I asked Mark casually over breakfast about his day, about his late meetings. His answers were clipped, nervous. Claire, oblivious to my growing awareness, continued her smile and charm routine around me. But I could see the tension in both of them when we were in the same room. They were careful, but they were also sloppy, and I was watching. That night, alone in our bedroom, I stared at the ceiling. Betrayal had always been a concept I studied quietly, in my journals, in my thoughts. But now, it was real. Not just an idea, not a hypothetical lesson learned from childhood neglect, it was burning in my life. And I realized something: they had underestimated me. They thought I would crumble, cry, or plead. They thought I would disappear into the shadows of my own heartbreak. But shadows, I knew, could be lethal. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I planned. The affair between my husband and my sister was no longer just a secret. It was a weapon, and I was ready to turn it against them. I began keeping meticulous records, noting their patterns, memorizing their routines, tracing their glues of secrecy, the small, telltale signs that marked their meetings. Every lie they told became another piece of ammunition, every stolen glance another reminder that I had been wronged. By the end of the week, a plan began to take shape in my mind. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming power. About showing them that underestimating me had been their first mistake. They had chosen betrayal, but I had chosen patience, observation, and strategy. And the game had just begun. Claire's birthday party was exactly what I had dreaded: crystal chandeliers, carefully curated music, the hollow laughter of people who were more interested in appearances than reality. I walked in, feeling the weight of every slight, every betrayal, every year I had been overlooked. And there she was, radiant as always, effortlessly charming, laughing with Mark at the center of her orbit. My chest tightened. I forced myself to step outside onto the balcony. The night air was cool, a brief reprieve from the heat building inside me. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was my parents. I took a deep breath and called them. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady, but low enough that no one nearby would hear. They stepped onto the balcony, fanning themselves with cocktail napkins as though their appearance was a courtesy, not a necessity. My father's eyes flicked around nervously. My mother's smile was polite but distant. "I need to tell you something," I said, glancing at them. "Mark, he's seeing Claire. I have proof. I've seen them together. Texts. Meetings. Everything. I know what's been going on." There was a pause. A long, quiet pause that felt like my chest would explode. "We know," my father said finally, his tone flat, almost casual. I froze. You knew? And you didn't tell me?" "Yes," my mother said softly, almost teasingly. "But we thought you'd react like you always do: cry, beg, disappear. We didn't think you'd do anything like this." My hands trembled around the edge of the railing. My entire life flashed in front of me. Years of neglect, of favoritism toward Claire, of being dismissed, overlooked, and minimized. You expected me to stay silent? To suffer in silence? You knew the man I loved was betraying me with my own sister, and you did nothing. They exchanged a glance, one that made my stomach twist with disgust. "Alice, just, maybe let it go," my mother said. "Don't ruin her party. It's a birthday, for heaven's sake. Be quiet. Don't make a scene." I clenched my fists, anger and hurt colliding inside me like wildfire. No. I am done being quiet. I am done being invisible. I am done being their victim. I didn't wait for them to respond. I turned and walked back inside, each step heavier than the last, adrenaline coiling in my chest. The party was in full swing. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. Claire stood in the center, radiant, smiling as if the world belonged to her. Mark lingered near her, hand resting lightly on her lower back, whispering something that made her laugh. My teeth clenched. I didn't hesitate. I moved forward, my hand shooting out with all the pent-up rage, slapping Claire across the face. The sharp sound silenced the nearest guests, their eyes widening in disbelief. Claire's hand flew to her cheek. Her perfect composure cracked in an instant. Before she could recover, I struck her again, harder this time, my anger and heartbreak fueling every movement. She staggered back, shocked, her eyes wide and panicked. Mark lunged toward me. "Alice, stop." I whipped around and slapped him as well, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical strike could. Stop? You had your chance to be a husband. You made your choice and now you face me. My parents rushed forward, alarm and panic on their faces. Alice, control yourself. I whirled toward them, eyes blazing. Control myself? After everything? You enabled her, ignored me my entire life, and now you expect me to stand here and be quiet while my own sister steals the man I loved? No, I am done being ignored. Done being invisible. Claire, trembling, tried to speak. Alice, it's not. Not what? I shouted, leaning close, my voice ice and fire. Not everything you've ever done? Not the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal? You think your charm excuses your cowardice? You're pathetic, Claire. Weak. A liar hiding behind a smile and pearls. Nothing more. Mark stepped forward, voice pleading. Alice, listen. I slapped him again, cutting him off. You're weak. Spineless. You promised me your love, your vows, and you chose betrayal instead. You're not a man, you're a shadow of one, hiding behind her every whisper. The room had gone silent. Guests gaped, some whispering, some frozen. My parents' faces were pale, their mouths opening and closing, searching for words that wouldn't come. Claire was trembling, her perfect mask shattered, shame replacing the arrogance she had always worn so effortlessly. I took a deep breath, letting the rage transform into sharp clarity. And you, I said, turning to my parents, you failed me. You've always favored her, ignored me, dismissed me, and expected me to suffer quietly. But no more. I am Alice. I am strong. I am seen. And from this moment, I decide my life. I paused, letting the words hang in the room, heavy and undeniable. Claire, you're nothing. A liar in pearls. Mark, you're a coward who betrayed every vow. And you, I said, gesturing to my parents, failed to raise a daughter worthy of love. But I am done hiding. I am done forgiving the unforgivable. I am done being your shadow. I am Alice, and you will never, ever underestimate me again. The room remained still, the air thick with tension. Guests whispered in disbelief, some shielding their children's eyes, others staring, unable to tear their gaze away. Claire sank to a chair, trembling. Mark stood frozen, guilt and fear written in every line of his face. My parents were pale, finally realizing that their favoritism, their neglect, and their silence had created a force they could no longer control. And I, for the first time in years, felt unburdened, alive, and unstoppable. I had spoken the truth. I had exposed the betrayal. I had reclaimed my life. The night air hit me as soon as I stepped out of the party, sharp and cleansing. The city lights shimmered through the damp streets, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Everything I had endured, every betrayal, every slight, every whispered lie, it stayed behind in that room, with Claire, Mark, and the parents who had failed me. I walked with purpose, letting my heels click against the pavement, each step a beat in a rhythm I had almost forgotten, the rhythm of my own life. Freedom. Power. Choice. These weren't abstract ideas anymore. They were mine. The next morning, my phone buzzed constantly. Messages, calls, notifications. Most were from my parents, panicked and confused. Alice, please come home, my mother's text. Mark called repeatedly. Each time I ignored the ring. His messages were desperate. Alice, please. I love you. We can fix this. I didn't mean to. The guilt, the regret, the panic, they all screamed through the screen, but I felt nothing but clarity. I had seen the truth. I had felt the betrayal, and I had no intention of returning to it. A week later, I delivered the divorce notice. Handed it to him myself, face calm, voice steady. It's over, Mark. I want nothing from you. Nothing. Not your apologies, not your explanations, not your excuses. I am done. He stood there, stunned, guilt and shock battling for control. Alice, please. I can explain. I can fix this. I swear it meant nothing. I can change. I looked him in the eye, unwavering. Change? You think a moment of betrayal can be erased by words? You chose her over me. You betrayed me. And you will live with that. Alone. He felt his knees, voice cracking. Alice, don't do this. Please. I love you. I swear I'll. You love her more, I said softly, almost pitying, as I handed him the final papers. I am done loving someone who chooses lies over loyalty. You will never control me again. Days passed. My phone remained silent from them, save for a few desperate calls and messages that I didn't respond to. And for the first time, I felt the fullness of a life rebuilt, my own life. I enrolled in new projects, started painting again, reconnecting with old friends I had lost in the chaos of family and marriage. Every brushstroke, every laugh, every moment I reclaimed was a small victory, a reclamation of the self I had almost forgotten. Claire tried to contact me, first with flowers, then with messages filled with false apologies. I didn't respond. She had taken everything she could, but I would not give her the satisfaction of attention. She was irrelevant to the life I was building, an unpleasant shadow, nothing more. My parents, too, began calling more frequently, panic escalating into guilt. I let a few calls go through, my voice polite but distant. I am living my life, I told them once. You made your choices. I am making mine. Don't call again unless it's to respect my boundaries. Mark sent flowers, letters, and emails for weeks, begging, promising, groveling, but each message only reinforced the truth I had already embraced. My life was no longer theirs to manipulate or break. I had walked away from betrayal, and there would be no return. Weeks later, I signed the final divorce papers. I walked out of the office feeling light, almost weightless. The sun was shining in a way that felt like permission to begin anew. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew this. I would never be silent again. I would never be invisible. And I would never, ever allow betrayal to define me. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, city lights spilling across the floor, and I allowed myself to breathe fully, to feel fully. I was Alice, untouchable, unbroken, unstoppable. And my life, finally, was mine. 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years since the night I walked out of Claire's party, since I slammed the door on betrayal, deceit, and the toxic family that had never truly valued me. So much had changed, and yet, every choice, every step, had led me to a life I could finally call mine. Alice. I lived in a modest yet elegant apartment downtown, the kind that felt like a sanctuary. Light spilled in through large windows in the morning, and the city's hum was a comforting rhythm rather than a source of anxiety. My career had flourished, my art had gained recognition, and my exhibitions were now featured in galleries that once felt unreachable. I had traveled, too, learning the joy of independence. Paris, Tokyo, New York, places I had only dreamed of before. I no longer needed validation from family or husband to feel complete. I had learned the power of self-reliance, and with it came an unshakable peace. I smiled often now, freely, without reservation. Sometimes, when a particular sunset caught my eye or a melody lingered in the air, I remembered the past. But the memories no longer carried pain, they carried proof of my strength. I had cut ties completely with my parents and Claire, and the silence was liberating. No phone calls, no manipulations, no demands. Just freedom. And love had returned on my terms. A kind, patient man who met me where I was, without expecting me to bend or hide. He wasn't Mark, and he didn't need to be. He was himself, genuine, loyal, and present. Together, we built a life full of laughter, late-night talks, and quiet moments where the world could pause around us. I was loved for who I truly was, and for the first time, I didn't question it. Mark had changed in ways I observed from the distance I wisely maintained. The divorce had humbled him, leaving scars he could not ignore. His career continued, but whispers of the scandal, the affair with Claire, followed him quietly in social circles and among friends. He had moved on, eventually marrying someone else, but the marriage lacked the depth and honesty that he had once lost with me. Occasionally, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he regretted the choices he made, but regret was no longer my concern. It was a lesson written in experience. Claire's life had lost the shine it once carried. Without my presence to validate her, without the thrill of betrayal to prop her up, her charm seemed hollow. She married years later, attempting to recapture influence and admiration, but those around her quickly learned that her manipulative ways could no longer dominate. Her marriage was functional, but joyless, filled with quiet resentment and occasional jealousy. She had power once, yes, but I had taken it from her not by force, but by refusing to participate in her games. My parents. They aged in ways I did not watch closely. Their lives continued, but the silence from me weighed heavier than any guilt they ever showed. Calls went unanswered, letters unopened. They were left to wrestle with their favoritism, their choices, and the reality that the daughter they had ignored and undermined had grown into a woman untouchable by their influence. Perhaps it was the hardest punishment of all, my absence, my independence, my refusal to seek their approval. And me? I was finally free. Free to create, to love, to laugh without restraint. I had built walls where they needed to be built and opened doors where life demanded beauty and joy. On weekends, I walked through the park with my partner, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. On evenings, I painted until my fingers were stained with color, each stroke a testament to the life I had reclaimed. The world felt full, warm, and safe, a stark contrast to the years of betrayal, manipulation, and neglect. I had survived every attempt to diminish me, every lie told, every heartache endured. And now I thrived. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the city skyline with pinks and golds, I stood on my balcony, the wind carrying the faint sounds of the bustling streets below. I inhaled deeply, a full, unguarded breath, and smiled. I had chosen myself fully and irrevocably. I had cut ties with those who harmed me, left behind the shadows of the past, and stepped into a life built entirely on my own terms. I was Alice. Strong, free, loved, and finally, undeniably happy. The city lights flickered below like 1,000 tiny promises, and I knew this. Nothing could take away the life I had earned. Not betrayal. Not lies. Not anyone. I had survived, I had thrived, and I had created my own happy ending.